Welcome to this, the first of the online debates for irishtimes.com. My name is Harry McGee. I'm one of the political correspondents with the newspaper and of course with the online site as well. I'm delighted to be joined for today's debate by Simon Coveney, a TD for Cork South Central. He is also the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and he also happens to be Fine Gael's Director of Elections for this referendum campaign. And I'm also joined by Mary Lou MacDonald, the Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Central, who is also the Deputy Leader of her party. You're both welcome to this debate. Simon Coveney, firstly, when you launched your campaign last week, you talked about stability, you talked about discipline, you talked about this bringing prosperity to Ireland. But subterraneously, or beneath the surface, there have been accusations that Fine Gael and the government has been indulging in scare tactics. A lot of people have directed their attention to Michael Noonan and what he has said about a harder budget this December, about him saying about the referendum being a debate about being in the euro or out of the euro. Are you scaring the electorate?
We're not, but I think we have a responsibility to be honest with them. There are significant consequences to voting no, just like there are consequences to voting yes. And I think the difference between a decision to vote yes or vote no will have an impact on the Irish economy, will have an impact on investor confidence. That is why practically every employers group in the country and a whole series of very large companies have openly come out and said, look, we need a yes vote in this referendum. And I mean, ultimately, this is about trying to build on what the government has been doing for the last 12 months, which is to try and put an economy back together, to try and put a country back together that was very much broken, to try and create jobs and get stimulus into the economy. And in order to do that, we need confidence from abroad and here at home. And if we can't guarantee future funding for this country through the ESM, and in my view, if we don't commit to responsible budgeting, which I think will also add to certainty in terms of where the country is going, well then I think we do risk making it more difficult for ourselves to create growth and jobs again in Ireland.
Okay.
And Michael Noonan simply gave an honest answer to a straight question. Will it be more difficult to put a budget together if people vote no? And the straight answer to that is yes, because our budgets are based on anticipated growth. And if we make it more difficult to create growth and create jobs in Ireland, well then of course it is more difficult to put a budget together to meet the targets we have to meet under our current programme between now and 2050.
Saying that it's not going to make any difference to the bailout, that if we pass this treaty, it won't make any difference to the bailout that we're currently operating. Yeah. By saying that, Michael Noonan is saying that it actually will.
No, but the conditions of the current bailout are about meeting deficit targets. And part of meeting those deficit targets are growth figures that are factored in as part of that. Like, the way Ireland will solve this problem is by growth, not more and more austerity and more cutbacks. We probably agree on that one issue. Right? And so we are endeavouring to get growth back into this economy. That is going to take time, but the most important element of that in terms of private sector investment in this country is confidence in the future direction of this country, as opposed to creating the kind of uncertainty that will definitely come from a no vote in terms of future funding of Ireland.
Okay, Mary Lou MacDonald, that question could equally be put to you, that this is a debate in which the no side have also been indulging in some scaremongering. You've described it as an austerity clause. The yes side said there's no justification for that. You've also put a figure of $6 billion on the austerity that you claim will come after this bailout programme has come to an end. Are you scaremongering as well?
No. So let's set the scaremongering aside and deal with some facts. First of all, I think people need to understand that irrespective of which way we vote on the 31st of May, we are members of the European Union. Our membership of the European Union is not in question. Irrespective of how we vote on the 31st of May, we are members of the Eurozone. The euro is the money in our pockets. Let's just be very clear about those things. We also have to say, as a matter of fact, that the government has consistently been forced to revise downwards its targets around growth. The IMF has equally done so, as have other international bodies. And the reason for that is because a strategy has been pursued, a very misguided strategy, that is about getting the economy back to equilibrium and back to growth through a strategy of cutbacks and austerity. And it is patently failing. If we go back to 2008, we had an exchequer deficit of 12 billion. You fast forward through 6 austerity budgets, 24 billion in cuts, huge hardship for people, tax rises, we know all of the story there. And you ask yourself then, when you come to 2011, how are we doing in terms of balancing our books? What you find, in fact, that the exchequer deficit doubled in that time and ballooned to 24 billion.
But they explained that to us a couple of years ago. They said it would be like a mountain peak, that there would be an increase, and then it would reach a peak, and then it would come down. And the government has argued, we've now reached the top of that peak, and from now on things will improve.
Well, I think, no, let me just go further. Well, I would strongly reject that. I think that the strategy, and the interesting thing is that people, not just in this country but beyond, have finally caught on to the fact that austerity is failing. It's failing as a policy direction. And maybe there's a point at which now politics and politicians need to actually catch up with the citizens. The Minister is right when he says that with the Troika, certain targets have been agreed. You're absolutely correct. The target that's envisaged is to reach a 3% budget deficit. That's the state of thing.
0.5%, we know that.
So
where are you getting your figure of €6 billion?
So, if we look at now, bear in mind this treaty introduces a new measurement, if you like, in respect of what's called a structural deficit. All of the experts tell us that it's problematic to measure precisely. But what we do know from the government's figures is that come 2015, there will be a structural deficit of 3.5%. And we will be required to move to throttle that back to 0.5%. Now, what does all of that?
Well,
what do all of those figures mean? Let me finish this point.
But that's not factually true.
Well, let me finish the point, then you can come back.
It is factually true. So, what does that mean? In practical terms, for the average citizen, it means that having gone through all of the austerity and hardship of the Troika programme, you come to 2015 and the goalposts are shifted again. And they're shifted again decisively in the direction of more cutbacks and more austerity.
Where's the 6 billion figure coming from?
And the 6 billion is a calculation of what it will be required, and actually it's in the government's own spring forecast, this figure, to get you from the 3.5 to the 0.5. Okay, that's where that figure is derived from.
Well, look, there's a number of things. First of all, people who are asking people to vote no as a vote against austerity are somehow pretending that if Irish people vote no, all of a sudden everything changes in Ireland. Whether we like it or not, we are committed, and the funding that we get to fund the state is conditional on our commitments to meet certain targets that are being laid out for us between now and 2015. That funding will come to an end at the end of next year. In 2014, Ireland will have a borrowing target of about 19 billion euros, and in 2015, a borrowing target of about 17 billion euros. Now, we need to ensure that we have a mechanism, if we cannot raise that money on the markets, which we hope to do, by building confidence in Ireland, which has been working over the last 12 months as we've seen the cost of Irish government debt come down. We need to know that there is a backstop if we actually can't raise that money, and that is what the ESM is about. On the issue of structural deficit versus actual deficit, I think Mary Lou is actually mixing the two things up. The whole purpose of having a structural or underlying deficit. No, but this is important, right? Because actually the Irish government want to have a structural deficit target, because the whole idea behind a structural deficit is to require countries to save when in good times, to actually spend money as stimulus in bad times. And a structural deficit takes account of exceptional or extraordinary conditions in an economy, like, for example, extraordinary bank debt, like, for example, promissory notes, like, for example, inappropriate pension structures that aren't affordable. And it allows us to make a deficit calculation based on a normal economy. And we can actually define that structural deficit in a way that suits the Irish economy. The Commission has already signalled this, as long as we actually put a definition of a structural deficit that suits the Irish economy and gets agreement with the Commission on that. So the structural deficit thing is actually a good thing. People should be welcoming it as a way of actually tailoring a solution for Irish problems. And people should recognise that. It's not the same as a normal deficit.
Whatever, but I'm conscious of not losing people in technical discussions around structural deficits. You welcome it, and that's fair enough. It's cyclical and all the rest of it. That's That's okay, be that as it may. Even those economists who argue in favour of this treaty have identified the kind of irrational and arbitrary target of 0.5%. They ask, well, why 0.5%? Why not 1%, 2%? And they ask a more even fundamental question. Even if you believe that that's the right approach, and that's your approach, Simon, and Fine Gael's approach, and that's okay. That's where you're coming from.
It's about responsible budgeting.
Why on earth would you insist on giving constitutional protection, which is why we're having the referendum, to a set of economic rules and regulations? And why would you furthermore ask the Irish people to hand over the prerogative in terms of policing those rules and regulations, fining in respect of those rules and regulations to the European Commission and the European Court of Justice? And let me finish by saying this.
Well, you've asked 3 questions now, so let me answer.
You have. Let them come back.
First of all, it is a perfectly reasonable thing to do for countries in the Eurozone to want to try and agree a common set of rules and standards around budgeting. Because if one country's economy collapses within the European Union, it affects everybody else. We've seen that in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in terms of contagion.
Weren't those rules already agreed in the
Yes,
six-pack?
they were. But they weren't.
Why the need to put it into law?
Because countries haven't been following up on their commitments. It was back in 1997, during the Growth and Stability Pact, that actually most of the commitments that we're now being asked to actually sign up to in this treaty were agreed. There were more measures confirmed 14 months ago in the six-pack. But history will tell us that large countries that have big political power and economic power in the European Union ignore the commitments that they made. And so what's different about this treaty is that we're putting it into Irish law, just like Germany are putting it into German law. And it's actually, we police, no. The other point on this is we police ourselves on this. This is about, we are setting up an independent fiscal council in Ireland. We've already set it up. They will be the people setting the targets and actually holding the government to account if we don't meet those. And if we don't meet those targets, yes, there are consequences with the Commission.
You say that it is reasonable to introduce those rules. Opponents will say it is not reasonable to add in what they describe as a blackmail clause. Adding the ESM and the availability of ESM funds to it, that you are putting a gun to people's head and saying, vote yes or else you won't get any funds.
We're not putting a gun to anybody's head. Right? That is not what we're about. What we're saying is there are 2 things that are happening with this treaty. First of all, we are signing up with another 24 countries to responsible budgeting into the future, to ensure that we don't have the kind of collapses that we've seen in European economies in the last 4 years. That is a good thing. Secondly, we are saying to countries that sign up to that discipline, if you have a fragile economy now or at some stage in the future, if you can't raise money in the markets, well then we will provide a fund for you to access money at cost or low interest rates. Because it is perfectly reasonable. If countries are going to contribute to a fund that becomes a rescue fund for other countries, that the countries that actually borrow money from that fund have to apply a certain set of rules to ensure that they're spending that money responsibly. You can't ask a country like Ireland or Germany or Spain or anybody else to contribute to a fund if you don't know that countries that access that fund won't spend that money responsibly. It's like lending money to a homeowner. You need to know that they're going to spend that money properly in a responsible way. And so the 2 things are linked, but they're both, from an Irish perspective, both very positive things. Responsible budgeting, which we have not seen in the past. We will ensure that any future government isn't going to be reckless with the people's money, and that's a good thing to sign up to.
That's a reasonable thing that Simon's saying. That's a reasonable thing for him to say, that there's a quid pro quo. If we show more discipline, the reward for it is that we get access to ESM funds. And you just can't have access to ESM funds without imposing some kind of discipline.
Well, bear in mind, first of all, the ESM, when it's set up, it's not yet established, will not be some kind of a charity fund. Bear in mind, should we ever have to avail of those funds, there will be strict conditionality attached to it. And bear in mind, if we go along with the Fine Gael argument and pass this treaty on the 31st of May, it'll be in a context in which not the Fiscal Council or the man in the moon, but the European Commission and the European Court of Justice will have very sweeping powers in terms of keeping us in check. I think it's important to say that there's nobody, I'm certainly not making an argument for irresponsible public spending. In these times, we know we need to be prudent and disciplined. But hold on, let me finish out.
Where are you proposing?
I think there needs to be some
euros over 2 years.
So, it's a kind of a self-defeating thing to say we want to make sure that states are on the straight and narrow by imposing these arbitrary and very strict rules, which of themselves force further contraction, and in the case of this jurisdiction, this state, keep the domestic economy on the floor and the unemployment lines long and the revenues need for our welfare spend high. That none of that makes any sense.
Sorry, that's the picture you paint, Mary Lou, but that is not. That's
sorry,
not
Simon.
the reality.
If you care to stray out from these rarefied surroundings and go and actually talk to citizens on the street, that's the reality of where things are at for people.
People say, Mary Lou, that your response doesn't bear any relation to reality, that if you look through the paper, you're talking about investment, you're talking about debt forgiveness, you're talking about debt reduction, you're talking about a whole-scale investment programme throughout Europe. That requires money. We don't have the money to do that at the moment. And the big question that's come in on tweets from people in relation to Sinn Féin's response is where are you going to get money in the event of a no vote?
Okay, so let's take that in two parts. The first part is around the issue of emergency funding. Now, bear in mind the government tells us that we won't need a second bailout, but let's imagine that we need one. They are suggesting that they are suggesting that the ESM, which bear in mind is a backstop and an emergency fund with the explicit aim of stability within the Eurozone, of which we're a part. Now, let me just say first off, I cannot envisage circumstances where Ireland would be in crisis, where the stability of the Eurozone would be jeopardised by refusing us funding. But let me go a step further and say this, just to remind people, that fund is not yet established. In order for it to be legally constituted and functional, this state, this government, the Dáil, has to give approval to it. So if Minister Coveney and others are so concerned about our access to that fund, they still have ample opportunity, ample space to actually address that issue of the blackmail clause, which, by the way, was inserted in late in the day on your watch. And I think you have a case to answer as to why that happened.
Where are you going to get the money?
So that's the emergency bit of it. In terms of funding day-to-day spending, we do have a deficit.
That is not the emergency bit of it, and I can't just let that go. If we cannot raise money in the markets,
we'll have to go for emergency, but nobody's disputing that, Simon.
We will need to raise 36 billion euros in 2014 and 2015. If we do not pass this treaty, we will not be able to access that through the ESM. The referendum commission has confirmed that.
Are you saying, because let's boil this down to what your position is therefore. You as a government are countenancing a scenario in the event of a no vote, which is a possibility. We do still live in a democracy, I'm told. In the event of a no vote, that your government will persist and put through legislation in respect of the changes required for this ESM that would rule Ireland out of it. Are you telling us that you would proceed in that manner?
First of all,
I find that even by the standards of your government fairly astonishing.
Let me answer the question. Can I speak now? First of all, you're wrong in terms of the setting up of the ESM. The ESM can be set up as long as 90% of the initial fund can be put in place. Ireland is making a contribution of 1.57% of that fund. So we can't stop the setting up of it even if we want to. That is a fact, right? And sorry, sorry. Harry's own article in the Irish Times from the other day, covering the Kevin Feeney, who is the head of the referendum commission on this, has confirmed that. That's not me saying it. It's a fact. Okay. So you spin a lot of things, but don't spin this one. The second issue is, and much more importantly than that, the second issue is, why would we possibly want to veto an ESM? When Ireland
is being ruled out and can't access it, that would be one good
European
reason.
countries have
Yes
come
or no?
together. European
not.
countries have come together and they have put in place a permanent rescue fund in place, which is going to be up to 700 billion euros. And it's there for fragile economies.
No, I know why it's there.
Yes,
people know why it's
there. And you're asking people to opt out of that. You're asking people to opt out of that.
I'm making a simple statement of fact. As we speak now, Minister, hold on, as we speak now, bailout funds are illegal. This 700 billion fund can only be established on a sound legal basis, and we have influence still in respect of that.
To employ the great political cliche, I think we're going to agree to disagree on that point, and we're going to come back to it, I'm sure, many times during the course of this debate. I'm very indebted to both Simon Coveney and Mary Lou MacDonald for participating in this first online debate on irishtimes.com. And for more coverage on this referendum, and indeed on all things political, just click on www.irishtimes.com.